Good evening, everybody. My name is E.R. Anderson. I'm the executive director of Charis Circle. Charis Circle is a nonprofit programming arm of Charis Books, and Charis Books is the South's oldest independent feminist bookstore. We are so honored to be here tonight with Kylie Cheung in conversation with Kat Tenbarge for a discussion of survivor injustice, state-sanctioned abuse, domestic violence, and the fight for bodily autonomy. Sounds like my house. Lots of traffic going.
Sorry about that.
Well, it's all good. In this book, journalist and Jezebel staff writer Kylie Cheung exposes the insidious and often unseen connections among domestic abuse, state-based violence, political disenfranchisement, and the carceral state. So I'm going to introduce Kat Tenbarge first. Kat is a tech and culture reporter at NBC News in New York City. Previously, she was a senior digital culture reporter at Insider. Her work includes investigating and reporting on sexual assault and abuse allegations. And because they met on Twitter, this collegiate love blossomed, and we get this beautiful conversation tonight. And so she's here to guide us through this conversation with Kylie, who is a journalist and author of 2 other books on gender and power, A Woman's Place and The Gaslit Diaries. Currently a staff writer at Jezebel, she previously worked on the culture desk at Salon and at several nonprofits where she researched reproductive health policy. She holds a BA in political science from the University of Southern California and lives with her pit bull chihuahua, Bucky. In their free time together, they enjoy watching NBA games and superhero movies. You can follow Cheung's work at KylieWrites.net and on her Twitter at Kylie T. Cheung. So welcome to you both, and welcome to everybody watching. I want to encourage folks to put any questions you may have in the chat or in the Q&A box at any time. It's not rude to ask questions at any time in the chat, and we'll just kind of save them up for the moment, but you're not interrupting by typing them. And it's good to kind of get them in early as they occur to you. And otherwise, we'd love for you to just sit back and enjoy this conversation and just be present with us. So thank you both so much for being here. We're really excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having us. Yeah, and thank you so much for introducing us. Yeah, it's really great to talk to everyone here. Yeah, I can definitely just kind of give like a summary of the book if that's helpful.
Yeah.
Well, Survivor Injustice explores how state violence entails more than, I guess, just the viral videos capturing acts of police brutality, but also entails the policies that deny people the resources that they need to live and to thrive, and the policies that might entrap victims of abuse in cycles of poverty or even result in their imprisonment, the policies that might force someone to remain in an abusive situation for access to healthcare and housing, or certainly the policies that can force people to remain pregnant against their will. And state violence is really what creates a lot of the conditions for interpersonal gender-based violence to thrive, really. And, you know, I think to that end, state and gender-based violence are really inextricable from each other. And, you know, I think what I really try to put forward in the book is that the state itself functions as an abuser, and that rape culture, which is the normalization of sexual violence and the dehumanization of survivors, fundamentally drives our policies and culture. And yeah, I think in the book, I try to drive home that domestic violence isn't just a private issue, but has tremendous political implications and impacts on people's access to public life and to voting, and to healthcare and so much more. And yeah.
Absolutely. I think that the book is extremely successful in conveying all of these points. You know, as I was reading it, I was like, Kylie is a force of nature, not only in your reporting on this issue, which everyone should be reading regularly, and also just in your ability to speak to the present moment, which I think that this book really encapsulates what a lot of people have been hearing about, feeling, and fearing over the past really 3 years in particular. And since it is such a book of the moment, you know, the first thing I wanted to ask you is sort of what inspired you to write this intersection of topics?
Yeah, you know, I think that this definitely kind of began as a project during at the start of the COVID pandemic in 2020, and how that led to a surge in recorded cases of domestic violence, which is what we often see when they're in the aftermath of uh, I'm thinking the right word, I'm forgetting, but in the aftermath of pretty monumental disastrous events. I think that we saw similar cases with Hurricane Katrina and with 9/11, and certainly when resources are more strained and people are spending more time in their homes, and I think that the fact that that coincided with the 2020 election was certainly concerning to me. And so I think that when I first started working on it 3 years ago, it first began as a project really to explore domestic violence, or to understand domestic violence really as an underexplored form of voter suppression, and as the urgent threat to democracy that it is, but that it often isn't recognized as. But then, I think amid a lot of the really big developments that happened that year around, and the important conversations around abolition and policing, and the impacts of our white supremacist police state on survivors, particularly, this expanded into a much broader exploration of survivor injustice.
That makes a lot of sense. I thought one of the things that really struck me about the book, and what you set out to do at the outset and follow through, is it's something that a lot of people overlook, is the impact on domestic violence when we look at events where people are forced into their home, or events where people are recovering from disaster. It's really striking, and I think really overlooked. And as sort of these events tallied up over the past few years, I was curious, what are some of the major sort of turning points or events that captured what you were exploring throughout the book?
Yeah, definitely. So certainly the overturning of Roe was a very big one, though. As I'd written, the book had been written before that happened, and a lot of what I'd included was, a lot of the cases of reproductive oppression that have long been building up to that outcome from last summer. But something I do try to really highlight in the book is that abortion bans in themselves are a form of gender-based violence, and when we see these policies, that certainly what that amounts to is really the state endorsing interpersonal acts of reproductive coercion, which I think speaks to how we've seen such an increase in cases of that in the last year. And that, the overturning of Roe, what it really does is escalate this long-term problem that has always existed of the surveillance and criminalization of pregnant people. And then another, I would say, I guess, touchstone event that really guided this book was certainly, as I mentioned, the events around the 2020 pandemic, with regard to some of the really important uprisings that we saw around racial justice and abolition. And I think, what this book really tries to do is reckon with how policing and prisons are unsalvageable. And I think that that's the case even as, sexual violence and survivors are often weaponized by people with bad intentions as a key reason why we need prisons and policing, when, what we've really seen is that survivors, and especially survivors of color, are highly policed and punished. And that's often the case, far more so than for perpetrators of violence. And so building on that, I think the book also tries to explore, or tries to really emphasize how carceral policy bleeds into all policy areas, whether it's reproduction and the family policing system, or, the weaponization of the legal system, and, the defamation trials that we often see used to silence and punish victims of abuse. And so one more touchstone event, certainly, and, I learned a lot from your incredible work on this issue as well, but the defamation trial between Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. And, I think that there were a lot of, I think, mixed feelings or trepidation about how to approach, I think, talking about it in the media early on, because, this was a case centering around celebrities, and there was, that dimension of it. But I think also what we really saw from this was, how its popularization of rape myths and, the tactics of abusers broadly, how, the consequences of that will certainly bleed out to survivors with the least resources, And, I think that some of what this trial popularized, for example, was, you know, what's called DARVO, or deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. And, a lot of the language about mutual abuse, and how essentially what that does is police and and victim blame for how people respond to or even try to defend themselves against abuse. And, when we see that idea popularized, I think, the consequences that has for all survivors are just very steep. And so, and certainly with regard to when law enforcement gets involved, but can definitely talk about that more later. But yeah, I think that those are some of the really key events that really shaped how what this book goes into.
Definitely. I feel like, Debt v. Heard being an example of something that was just an earth-shattering, I think, moment. And for me, having reported on sexual assault in the years leading up to that trial, it still, I would say, just opened my eyes to kind of what you, I think, talk about in the book very succinctly, is sort of this idea that it is a broken system. Like, when you have the most common response from people is, if we just have higher rates of reporting for sexual violence, if we just involve the police more in sexual violence, if women were free to report, then things would get better. But then when you actually look at the reality, not just in the defamation trials that we see, and certainly not just among the celebrity women who we see affected by domestic violence, but on every single level, the police officers who respond in the rare cases that they do, the way that they treat survivors, the way that the court system re-traumatizes and fails survivors, and ultimately how the entire carceral system itself perpetuates the violence that it's supposed to stop. One thing that you talk about a lot in the book that I thought was really informative was how the Violence Against Women Act actually helps shape this carceral system, and how it enforces a lot of the same things that in theory it should be protecting women from. So I wanted to ask you to kind of go into what that history looks like and how it has played such a harmful role.
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the background and the history that the book goes into is how, in the 70s and the 80s, and those years kind of leading up to that legislation, we saw a lot of organizing in the form of consciousness raising about the pervasiveness of sexual violence and gender-based violence. But, I think that a problematic aspect of this was certainly that the most publicly visible and publicly sympathetic advocates in that space were middle class or wealthy white women who were comfortable with tying their movement and their organizing to policing. And so I think by the 90s, which is when the Violence Against Women Act emerged, it actually coincided with a major expansive crime bill that President Biden was active in shaping. And, I think that we can, for example, maybe see that reflected in how about 2/3 of the funding of that law goes toward investments in policing, and just 1/3 for actual direct victim services. And so, I think that in addition to that, like in terms of how the law is a product of that era, I think that we can see, there's just in general, there's a lot of emphasis, I think, on like stranger danger language or framing when we talk about gender-based violence, which I think helps to essentially erase just how pervasive domestic violence in the home is, or the reality that most victims of rape and sexual assault know or have personal relationships with their assailant. And what I think that a lot of this framing often does is, or in terms of framing sexual or gender-based violence as like street-based crime, I think what we've seen is that reinforces this imagined need for investments in policing. And then in addition to that, with the Violence Against Women Act itself, there are multiple pieces of it that are actively quite harmful to victims of abuse. I think, for example, there's an arrest requirement that states that if it's not clear who the primary aggressor is, then both the abuser and the victim can be arrested. And I think that, or there's plenty of data that shows that how police are just so fundamentally ill-equipped to handle the sometimes complexities of these situations. And I think, for example, there's a survey that's shown, I believe, a quarter of women who have called the police to report intimate partner violence or sexual assault say that they themselves were arrested or threatened with arrest by police who deemed them to be the primary aggressor. We certainly saw that with the case of Gabby Petito in 2021, and which is a lot to just get into as a side tangent, but we can talk about that more later, certainly. And then other pieces of the Violence Against Women Act include that victims can be jailed to compel them to testify against their abusers, or even that they can't withdraw a police report once it's made, even when we know that victims can often have a strong motivation to protect their abuser and have complicated relationships in that regard. And yeah, I think also, that being said, I just think, it can be a difficult conversation to talk about the Violence Against Women Act. Sorry, there's some outside noise. But because I think, I think that it was beneficial to the extent that it was beneficial toward, I think, creating recognition of domestic violence as a public policy issue and as a violation and not just a private matter, because that was very much, I think, the mainstream thinking about it for many years. And I would say even today we can still see some of that thinking. For example, when there's like a high profile abuser or someone who might be like in the entertainment industry and people love his art, and like if there are allegations against him, there will be a lot of backlash about how that's like just his private life and he should be able to keep doing his work when it is clearly a workplace issue. So I think we still see some of those impulses to this day. But yeah, I think kind of an example of how much domestic violence was understood as a very excusable private issues. I think about the anecdote of Kitty Genovese in, I believe in the early 1960s, and she's a woman who was killed right outside her apartment building, when many of her neighbors were present, or she was raped and killed, and no one intervened. And that story is often cited as an example of the bystander effect, which is that people won't intervene if they think someone else will. But, I think that when one of the neighbors was interviewed, he said that he heard what was happening, but that he thought it was just a lover's quarrel. And I think the insinuation of that is that violence would have been okay if it was just a matter between like a husband and his wife. And, I think that that again just kind of speaks to this understanding of domestic violence as being permissible because it's like a private matter. And so I do think that, taking that step to recognize it as a public policy issue is important. But, nonetheless, I do think that as I write in this book, the law is certainly inseparable or inextricable from, what's known as the sexual assault to prison pipeline, through which about 90% of incarcerated women experience sexual violence before going to prison. And, I think that that's just one of the many longer term impacts of sexual assault that will expand beyond the assault itself. There's a lot of really powerful data around that. For example, I believe, sexual violence is the most costly crime of all crimes, where it costs victims $127 billion per year. And, I think that can certainly push victims deeper into poverty or toward committing survival crimes that can result in their criminalization and incarceration. And yeah, sorry, I'm kind of just going on a tangent at this point, so I'll cut myself off. But
no, no, it's all important. I feel like it really speaks to the fact that the Violence Against Women Act has a complex legacy and a very checkered pattern of impacts. One thing that I noted while reading the book is when you look at Republican opposition to the act, it's fascinating to me how even the rhetorical or semantic value of speaking out against women's rights can be more valuable to the conservative platform than supporting what is sort of a cloaked racist policing system that is being enacted by this act. Like, it shows where these priorities lie, and it also shows that in the passage of the act, you do have not just a symbolic, but certainly in addition, a rhetorical success of prioritizing the issue of domestic violence. And I think what you clarified about the public versus private sphere is also very important as well, and plays into the next topic that you sort of address in the book, looking at the overturning of Roe and what this means for pregnant people as well as pregnant survivors. There's sort of a three-pronged system of overarching effects involving reproductive coercion, violence against pregnant people, and the criminalization of certain pregnancy outcomes. So I was hoping you could explore how the overturning of Roe has impacted these areas.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I think that a lot of what we see around pregnancy criminalization kind of stems from this concept that we're certainly seeing more of in the absence of Roe, called fetal personhood, where what that does is it really ensures that the pregnant person, or it kind of puts forth that the pregnant person's rights are secondary to or at odds with the fetus. And, what that really does is creates an environment where the pregnant person is just exponentially more vulnerable to state violence in the form of criminalization and imprisonment. And there are a lot of cases of this that I could certainly go into, but in terms of how we've also sometimes seen pregnancy criminalization as really as a tool to further enact abuse or state violence on victims of abuse. I think, or in 2019, there was the case of Marche Jones in Alabama, who was jailed for losing her pregnancy after being shot in the stomach because police had said that she started the fight or something like that, and had jailed her as a result of that. And I think that certainly speaks to how victims of violence can be criminalized for their pregnancy outcomes and for the violence that's perpetrated against them. And just last month, we had the case of a teenager in Nebraska who was sentenced to 90 days in jail for a self-managed abortion that took place before Roe was even overturned. And she'd said in court that she'd had her abortion to escape an abusive relationship. And then, even after the child is born, we have laws called failure to protect laws in a lot of states where essentially mothers who do have kids can often enough be criminalized for abuse that their kids suffer from someone else, who could include, maybe the mother's abusive partner. And we don't see that same standard to be applied to fathers, and it's very gendered in that way. And then even more broadly, I mean, outside of the criminal system, we just have a lot of cases, or we see broadly this trend of victims' reproductive capacities as a tool for abusers. And I think, in the last year, the National Domestic Violence Hotline has reported that calls they've received about reproductive coercion post-Roe have doubled in the last year without that ruling. And when I spoke to them, and yeah, this was too late to be in the book, obviously, but they told me that one of their callers was someone whose partner had intercepted her birth control, and she lives in a state where abortion is banned, and she had an unwanted pregnancy. They hear a lot from callers who have heard from their partner or whose abusive partners will weaponize a lot of the misinformation that's going around about abortion bans right now, where pregnancy outcomes being criminalized. That happens all too often, but all of the bans in effect don't explicitly criminalize the person who has the abortion. And yet, there are a lot of people who have called the hotline about partners who say that they'll report them to the police and they'll go to jail if they have an abortion and such like that. And then, we've also already seen in terms of people's reproductive capacities being weaponized against them and used by their abusers. Going back to that concept of fetal personhood, we've already seen, numerous cases of custody battles over embryos. And, we know how that can certainly tie people to their abusers through long-term legal fights. And, we're certainly going to see more of that. We've also had Texas's SB 8 abortion law, which allows anyone to sue the people who have helped someone have an abortion. And that can certainly allow rapists and abusers to quite literally profit off of their victims' pregnancy. We've seen custody battles, very long-term custody battles for children conceived from rape-induced pregnancies. And, the unfortunate reality is we'll likely see more of that as people are unable to get abortion care after a rape-induced pregnancy. And, I would certainly argue that, just the soaring maternal mortality rates that we've seen, that as a direct result of abortion bans and the shuttering of maternal care and of maternal care and labor and delivery care as a result of that, is certainly an act of state violence. And yeah, I think, as I mentioned, when it comes to more abortion bans, and that will certainly mean more rape-induced pregnancies being carried to term, and more of this just horrific phenomenon of people sometimes being forced to co-parent with their rapists or participate in very lengthy and just re-traumatizing ongoing legal battles with them. And I've spoken to several people who have had that experience. I think that a part of that I think there's a lot of emphasis that's often placed on how a lot of these abortion bans don't have rape exceptions. But at the same time, I think that what we've seen is that all exceptions, including rape exceptions, have proven to be very unhelpful to actual victims or to victims, and also just the reality that access to healthcare shouldn't depend on the ability to adequately prove your trauma to the state. And so I hope that answers what you were asking.
Definitely. Absolutely. I think it's so jarring to consider the ways in which not only women, but mothers specifically, and all people who have children are targeted by the judicial system. I was thinking about how the concept of parental alienation has been further used and weaponized against women and mothers, and just the realities of, particularly in the period after overturning Roe, it's hard to me that people don't realize how the state and the carceral system is poised to violate women and enact violence against women, which of course is the conclusion that you lay out when you describe the state as an abuser in itself. Moving into what you describe in the book as sort of solutions and frameworks for justice for survivors, some of the things that you talk about are as transformative justice, and other sort of solutions that you lay out. I was curious, can you go into detail about what some of these concepts mean and how they can be applied?
Yeah, definitely. I certainly, like, me as like one person, I don't have like solutions to these huge endemic problems. But, I definitely think what I try to do in the book is lay out, different ways that we can approach moving away from understanding the criminal system as like the default medium through which to respond to sexual harm and to all forms of harm. Certainly when we've seen by now how the criminal system treats survivors. And so to that end, as you mentioned regarding civil suits as one avenue for that, certainly the legal system broadly is fraught with misogyny and bias toward victims. But, I think that there's certainly an argument for civil suits as being, for some survivors, a more comfortable option. And, certainly civil suits, we certainly see a lower evidentiary standard than, if survivors were to than within the criminal system. So that's definitely something to consider. What really informed my perspective on this was the incredible book, Sexual Justice by Alexandra Brodsky, which is just such an incredible read. Definitely recommend it. She really explores and draws on her legal expertise to look at how organizations like churches or communities or campuses or employers can, internally determine ways to address sexual misconduct in a timelier or more transparent or more humane manner that isn't often available to victims of the criminal system. And now, in many cases, obviously, they could, and they often do enough to fall short or can be actively harmful. But again, what I am really trying to emphasize in the book is that this is about increasing the options that are available to survivors beyond the criminal system, and I think that can be a part of that. And then, of course, there are the concepts of and then the book also explores restorative and transformative justice, which, just for brief working definitions, restorative justice is about, centering the victim and their community this process necessitates the perpetrator of harm accepting responsibility for that harm and actively trying to do the work to repair it for the victim and the community. And it's very victim-centric to what their needs are for healing and support. And then transformative justice is about recognizing how systemic oppression is really at the root of all of the forms of harm that we see, and that, in order to meaningfully address that requires us to change and to address those conditions that are at the root of it. And so I think, what I would really say that the book tries to emphasize is how restorative justice is about really moving away from measures that are punitive for the sake of being punitive, but at the same time, what that is not the same as excusing or justifying acts of harm with impunity, which I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in some recent cases, I think certainly with regard to around the sentencing of Tory Lanez earlier this month, what we can often enough see is how this language can be co-opted in bad faith to give abusers who take zero responsibility for their actions, essentially to give them a pass. And I think that isn't what restorative or transformative justice are at all. And so, seeing them be co-opted in that way is certainly concerning. And then, something else that I try to give consideration to in the book is just that I think a very difficult reality certainly is that when we're in a carceral society, it's just very difficult for restorative justice processes to, or that is certainly an impediment to that, because when the stakes are prison, of course it's going to be a lot less likely that an assailant is going to accept responsibility for their harmful actions. And I think that that's very sad, because all survivors and victims are going to have different needs in order to heal and be supported. But certainly in some cases, what can be very healing is having someone accept responsibility for their actions and apologize and truly try to repair that. But again, I think our chances of seeing that are a lot less likely when we live in kind of the conditions that we live in. And so, ultimately, I think what I really try to put forth as I talk about some of these working ideas for solutions, sorry, so sorry, is that the highest priority is really moving away just from this one-size-fits-all carceral system, or the one-size-fits-all solutions that are offered to victims and survivors within the carceral system, when what all survivors want and need is going to look vastly different, and the carceral system does not give space to that at all.
Yes, I think that makes a lot of sense, and particularly I think what you said at the end there is extremely accurate in the stories that I've heard from victims, as well as even in some cases from accused perpetrators, is this idea that it's very difficult to admit guilt in a society that prioritizes this form of punishment, in which you yourself may be assaulted and abused along the way as the only solution. So I think that's very, very true. And so moving over to, we do have some input from the audience. CH had a comment and a question regarding the story of Kitty Genovese. CH said that it's interesting, the real story involves many police calls from neighbors and the police choosing to ignore them and then starting to interrogate her female partner as the perpetrator. More state violence and perhaps state murder via inaction, which is so classic. Like this just fits so well into the framework that we're discussing, in that police in many cases, including contemporaneously, will either invent fictitious stories to try to excuse inaction or justify misbehavior or mistakes. In this case, choosing to blame it on people for not calling them, when in reality they ignored the situation and incorrectly identified the perpetrator. And then CH also had a question, which is correct to use domestic violence versus intimate partner violence? This is a very good question. How do we include children in these homes and in these parents' relationships?
Yeah, no, I think to your point, those are such important details about that anecdote that we often just get like this snippet of, and that snippet is obviously, it does not include any of, the incompetence of law enforcement or or any of like even really much of like the gender-based violence aspects of it. It's really just, oh, here's this story of bystander intervention, and not like, again, like how policing very much harms and can result in or contribute to the deaths of victims of abuse. In terms of domestic violence and intimate partner violence, domestic violence certainly includes intimate partner violence and a wider range of, I think, violence in the home and such, as I understand it. I don't know, Kat, if you want to speak on that at all, but that's my understanding. Yeah, and in terms of including children in these homes and parents' relationships, is there like a specific, more specific question around that, or?
I think that, it kind of gets in, it's more like which term do we use? Do we use domestic violence more broadly, or do we use intimate partner violence? And I think that you're right in saying that when we use the intimate partner violence terminology, it is typically referring to specifically people who are in intimate relationships. And this is something that I have encountered working in the field, is just I've seen a lot of people move toward using that terminology in that framework. But I do think that it's specific, because if you do want to talk about abusive relationships that are not between intimate partners, or if you do want to speak more broadly to the other people who are observing, in many cases this is children who are affected by domestic violence in the home, then I do think domestic violence continues to be the most all-encompassing terminology. And I feel like I almost lean toward using domestic violence only because in many cases there are children who are experiencing effects, or in many cases I find that domestic violence broadly encompasses harm that often goes ignored. And it's something that you speak about in Survivor Injustice as well. Like going back to how in Oklahoma, the fact that 50% of people in Oklahoma report experiencing domestic violence, that is such a shocking and staggering and sobering statistic. And so in that case, I feel like domestic violence really applies to encompass the totality of harm when you see statistics like that, because of course there are people broadly being affected outside of just the perpetrator and the victim.
Right, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. Sorry, I was a bit confused by the question, but
no, you're fine. We also have another question from Allison, who said, such an important topic. In your research, did you come across information about how frequently intimate partner violence results in brain injury? The community of professionals who work with people who experience violence is often siloed from the community of brain injury professionals, though there are places where the two communities intersect together, or there are places where we're trying to bring these two communities together. Brain injury is often overlooked when assessing injury and can be the cause of many symptoms that make navigating life a lot harder.
Yeah, I think that's so important. Sorry that I can't be super helpful in this, and that I didn't, and that brain injury is not something that I went into specifically in the research that I was doing. But, I think to your point, in terms of the impacts that domestic violence and intimate partner violence can have on victims and their mental and physical health, I think that that's something that's often very unexplored as well, and that I do try to look at the longer term impacts of abuse in the book. And I think certainly we have really seen in a lot of cases, again, I don't know how relevant this is maybe to the question, but we've seen a lot of cases of victims of abuse, their mental health really being weaponized against them by perpetrators of abuse through, we've seen a lot of like smear campaigns to attack their credibility if they struggle with any mental illness, and how we've seen that attack or used to attack their credibility in some very concerning ways. That was certainly a feature of, the defamation trial between Amber Heard and Johnny Depp. That was certainly a tactic. But again, sorry, I don't know if that really speaks to your question, but I do think that that's such an important point, and that there certainly does need to be more research into that for sure.
I agree. I was actually just seeing something on, I think, Twitter in the last day or two about how this is such an overlooked issue, and particularly when victims of domestic violence are like hit or slapped really aggressively in the face or around the head area. This is something that doesn't always leave a mark. Oftentimes it does, of course, leave marks, it does leave bruising, but even if it doesn't, that sort of repeated blunt force trauma to the head has kind of that invisible, in many cases, impact on the victim, on their long-term health, on their immediate health. A lot of times victims of domestic violence aren't, trained or assessed for concussions. So that's definitely something that plays a role as well. And even developmentally, there was a really sobering story from ProPublica this week, from ProPublica, about a child victim of domestic violence and how parental alienation played into that court case. And some of the observations that doctors were making involve the child's head being injured. And so when you look at sort of the developmental injuries that may result because of that. I think it's a really overlooked area, and definitely a factor that plays into this being a public health crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I'm not seeing other I can definitely, there was a question I wanted to ask you, Kat, and I don't think we got to that. But yeah, I wanted to talk to you certainly about how, in recent years, what it's been like working in media and covering gender-based violence. And, I think that as we talked about, there have been just so many very landmark events and very disturbing conversations in digital media or on social media and in digital media that we've seen. And yeah, so I wanted to turn it over to you, since you've just done such incredible work around this issue, and would love to hear your perspective on everything.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. You've done amazing work in this area as well. I literally every week I'm like, oh, there's Kylie's latest. But so, I think one thing that really stands out to me that deserves a lot of scrutiny from people within the media, as well as people who hold the media accountable. When we look at how journalists as individuals and media organizations treat survivors, I think one thing that can be lost a lot of the time is that as journalists, we may be somewhat of a first responder in regards to, we may be the first person or one of the few people who a survivor is recounting this experience to. Most of the survivors who I've spoken to never reported their alleged assault to the police. And so apart from friends and loved ones, and in many cases, I was the person who they were for the first time going through every single step of this process. And so, it's both a difficult and rewarding part of the job, because what a lot of victims have said is that it can be very therapeutic to talk through these things in that capacity and have like a trained professional who is trauma informed listening along the way. But it's something that I wish more journalists were cognizant of, because it's really in our duty as, the journalistic principle of uplifting the powerless. It's in our duty to support people as they're coming to us to tell their traumatic stories, to re-traumatize in many ways. The process of interviewing can be very re-traumatizing. So that's kind of something that I've experienced that I wish more journalists would consider. And in particular, something that a lot of my reporting has focused on is in the cultural reaction to things like the Debbie Heard trial and the Megan Thee Stallion shooting and the trial of Tory Lanez. Something that a lot of journalistic organizations strive for that I find to be sort of miscalculating in how it turns out is the idea that you're striving for objectivity in these cases. It often gets sort of twisted along the way. And what I mean by that is when you look at the mainstream coverage of Debbie Heard, it wasn't until after the trial concluded in a lot of cases that we saw people speaking out about the unfair treatment or reporting on the unfair treatment that Amber Heard received, the way that the cultural discourse poisoned and spread misconceptions and misinformation, not just about Amber, but about all victims. And in looking at just the way that the media strove to be neutral, in a lot of the way it perpetuated one of the most difficult and harmful myths about domestic violence in my experience, the myth of mutual abuse. The idea that both Amber Heard and Johnny Depp could have perpetrated domestic violence against each other is something that I think a lot of media organizations, either unintentionally or in many cases, I don't think journalists realize that this is a myth. And so you see people pushing this theory that is really, really damaging. And, we brought up Gabby Petito earlier, Kylie, and we saw the exact same thing happen in that case. Like the media attention, it's both too up to the minute, like it's almost like it's too reactionary with Gabby Petito. I remember when the first video footage surfaced of when they had the encounter with the police. Journalists rushed to replicate and like print this in full and like show the video on the news, and it was everywhere. And a lot of people's reaction to seeing that video was they thought that Gabby Petito perpetrated domestic violence, when the sad truth is that she had literally just been murdered. So that was kind of a humongous journalistic failing, in my opinion. And I think we saw that repeated during the Debbie Heard trial, as well as sort of in some cases in ways that the Megan Thee Stallion testimony was reported on, and in the ways that journalists failed to report on sort of the misinformation and the way that new media was spinning that case. And I know I'm going off in so many different directions, but the one other thing with Depp v. Heard and with Megan Thee Stallion's case as well, although I think there was a little bit better coverage because it was less of a long-term incident. Like, I think there was a lot of journalistic coverage of what happened the night that Megan Thee Stallion was shot. I think a lot of audience members just chose to look at biased sources. But when we look at how the media covered Depp and Heard's relationship, there was so little reporting on whether domestic violence occurred in the relationship. Like, almost all of the reporting was on the defamation trial. And so when you do that, you let the defense attorneys set the agenda for how you're covering the case. Because it was like, today, Depp's team said this and Amber's team said this, and that's all we're going to say. When what we could have done as an industry, and what I think we should do in the future, is actually report on the key issue, which is whether domestic violence occurred in this relationship, and if it did, who was it perpetrated against? Because we had a wealth of evidence, and almost no one put out a definitive report saying there was domestic violence in this relationship. So that's something I just really hope that we strive for in the industry. And Kylie, this is something that you do in your reporting, and it's something that you do in Survivor and Justice as well. So I wish that everyone would just be more like you.
Thank you. I don't know about that. Thank you. And yeah, no, I agree with everything that you've really laid out. And yeah, I think, really going back to, what you'd mentioned about the video involving Gabby Petito. I mean, it just that their interaction with law enforcement was just, there's so much about it that was so disturbing to me. I mean, the way that, police had received several calls of people who'd witnessed him hitting her. They'd witnessed, there'd been several witness calls about that, I understand. And then, in the video at some point you can see that she's very distraught, understandably so. And then he, or Brian Landry, who's her abusive partner, he's very calm, and so police they naturally kind of gravitate toward and listen to his side of things. One of them, if I recall correctly, fist bumps him. The police put him up in a hotel, and they have her sleep in a car, and they're on a road trip, so they're literally traveling. They don't live here. This is very unfamiliar territory for them. She's clearly in the midst of a mental health crisis, and the police they determine her to be the aggressor. And I think at one point they tell her they would have had grounds to arrest her or charge her because they deem her to be the assailant. They have her sleep in the van, and they put him up in a hotel. And I mean, it's so disturbing, and it speaks really exactly to I don't know, all of these problems. And then, one of the officers who was there, and again, if they had any actual knowledge or background in how these situations work, it could have been very different. But that's just not, I mean, it's just the nature of law enforcement, really. And then one of the officers who was part of that, he actually had a history in another town in Utah where he was, I believe, the sheriff there, where he, I believe, threatened to kill his ex-partner there multiple times. But he and the mayor were friends. The mayor had appointed him, and the mayor continued to defend him. And so, I think if that gives you any idea of how equipped these two were to respond to that scenario. But yeah, again, I think just in so many ways, all of that and how that went down and what ended up happening, which is him or Brian Landry killing her, I think that just really speaks to, just the endemic. I don't even know if I want to say failures of law enforcement, because I think it's much deeper than that. I think it's the active ways that they're very harmful to our victims of abuse and are often perpetrators of abuse themselves. So
yes.
Yes.
Yes. I also feel like in the way that mass media consumed the video footage, it reminds me of how similarly to the recordings of Amber Heard were consumed in the mainstream media. And all the time, once you start realizing it, you realize it's everywhere. There are portrayals all over the internet going viral of women reacting very emotionally, and we don't necessarily see the abuse because the person holding the camera is a lot of times the boyfriend, the husband, the person who maybe possibly put this woman through a situation where now she's actively reacting to being gaslit, actively reacting to being betrayed, to being abused, and people see these videos, and what they interpret it as is this woman is crazy, this woman is manipulative, this woman is the abuser. And so it's just so difficult and harmful because the mass media consumption of this type of footage, which has just become more and more pervasive, with obviously the pervasiveness of social media, the pervasiveness of smartphones, the ability for any abuser to have a recording device in his or her pocket that they can take out and film their victim in whatever state that they've brought them to, and then post that online. And so this is something that I just foresee becoming an even bigger problem, because it's like almost every day on the front page of Reddit, crazy ex-girlfriend loses her mind. And I just am like, I don't even want to see it. Like, I just can't even see it. Ugh.
Oh, God. No, that's such a good point. Just such a horrific, like, can of worms that we are all now living through. I mean, yeah. And I just can't even imagine, like, someone who would just, I don't know, like the feeling of like being excited or like gratified to see and hear like that kind of thing. I mean, it just, yeah. Well, on that note,
I don't know if we have any, I don't think we have any more questions, but this is sort of like a last call if anyone does want to ask anything. But other than that, I think I did have one more thing I wanted to ask you, Kylie. Oh, yes. Okay. I feel like kind of a takeaway question that I had for you, and something that I also want to like learn and work on, is because of, I think, our roles in the media too, it's very easy to focus on the most prominent and the most privileged victims of domestic violence and abuse. And so looking toward how we can shift cultural narratives and refocus on the most common forms of people who are victimized, especially women of color, Black women, incarcerated women, disabled people, disabled victims. How do we kind of like moving forward recenter our conversations from sort of the victims who we most commonly and frequently see represented toward the people who are most commonly experiencing these types of harm?
Yeah, no, definitely. That's such an important question. You know, what I kind of reflexively think about is, I think one example of, being like a very high profile case of abuse that we all, that there was a lot of attention on, certainly, the Amber Heard and Johnny Depp defamation trial. But, I think what was so interesting about that was that, defamation trials have really always been used to punish and to silence and threaten victims of abuse. And certainly we see that. I think the organization Know Your Nine has done a lot of incredible research on how that's often, or how that's especially been applied to campus sexual assault survivors who often have very little resources and certainly don't have the resource, or certainly don't have the resources of a famous actor, even though, even with those resources, we all have still seen how she was treated. So I think that's certainly one example of it. And then another thing that I really think about is, when we talk about some of the like what's kind of discussed as the solutions to gender-based violence and such in the mainstream, I think, we should certainly kind of, or I think what I try to do in the book is, and what I think we should all do, is really question, what the different impacts of some of those solutions would be on different people with different experiences and from different communities. I think, like the conversation around the Violence Against Women Act is definitely one aspect of that, because, there's a very specific type of victim that law is designed to serve. And then, of course, even then, not quite. But I think, if you actually, I think some of the most vocal critics of the Violence Against Women Act have been, or I think that some of the most important criticisms of it have been made in, for example, I think the book Abolition Feminism Now by Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, among other just incredible Black abolitionist authors. And I think that, I think there's just a lot of different examples. I think just when we talk about carceral feminist solutions generally, I think, when we look at a lot of the things that we've been sold on as like the solutions to these crises, when we like peel back the layers of who is proposing them and like from what lived experiences, and then, when we certainly look at how different communities would be affected by that. That's kind of my thinking in terms of how we can start to, have conversations that don't just center one type of rich celebrity white woman victims, which is what we often see. And, certainly, I mean, anyone can experience abuse, and that's certainly true. But, I think if anything, what that speaks to is just how much worse and how much more predatory and dangerous that can be for those who experience abuse and have even less resources.
Definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Well, I think that wraps up a lot of what we were talking about. Kylie, thank you so much. This has been super informative. Everyone, please read and buy Survivor Injustice and Charis books. Over if there's anything else we wanted to say.
Yeah, thank you so much. We want to encourage folks, to click this teal button at the bottom center of the screen, and you can buy Survivor Injustice from Charis. It's just a one click button. And also, this is a great book to request your local public library carry. We really want this to get into libraries and get into the hands of folks who most need it. So be sure to do that. You could also donate a copy of the book to a library of your alma mater. So consider doing that. We appreciate everybody who is here tonight and asking great questions. We'll be adding captions to this and putting this on our YouTube channel, which is just /Charis Circle. And we'd love for you to share it with anyone who you wish was here tonight but wasn't able to be here. So until next time, thank you both so much, Kat, Kylie. We really, really appreciate your important work. We're so grateful, and we hope that you both stay safe and well.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us. And this was so lovely.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone, for coming as well.
Yeah.
Good night, y'all. Thank you.
Good night.